We're going to get started. We're passing around a sheet where you can, again, write down your name and birthday so we can get you an account for the survey activity that we're going to do in a couple days. So now we're going to talk a little bit about ethics. Then we're going to have a little coffee break, and we're going to talk some more about ethics. So the way we're going to split it up is in this first chunk, we'll talk about some sort of big picture conceptual issues that I think will be very helpful to you. And then in the second chunk, we'll talk about some very specific areas where you've probably already run into difficulties. And that will give us a chance to try to apply some of these ideas in sort of realistic settings. I should also say that so far we haven't had a lot of questions and participation, and here that would be very, very welcome. I know that many of you, I heard some at dinner last night, have been grappling with some of these issues in your own work. So you should feel welcome to ask questions or raise ideas. I know ethics can be sometimes an uncomfortable thing to talk about, but it's uncomfortable for me to talk about it too, but it's something I think we have to talk about and we can't avoid, and we shouldn't avoid. Okay, so why should we care about ethics? So aside from the fact that we all, I hope, want to be good people, I think there are some other reasons that we should really care about ethics. There are the fear-based reasons, and these are the reasons that you sometimes hear, like people can do really bad things with big data, and something bad is going to happen, I'm going to get in trouble, or we as a community are going to have someone do something wrong that's going to mess everything up for all of us. So as individuals, sometimes we can be afraid of getting in trouble, and we can also be worried about what's going to happen to our community. So these are not the reasons I'd like to focus on. These are real concerns. I'd like to focus on some hope-based reasons. So here, I think there's actually a lot of stuff that we could be doing that would be responsible that we are not currently doing because there's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty about what is ethical and permissible and what is appropriate. And I think that if we could develop shared norms and understandings, then we could do a lot more research. So let me give you an example of this. So during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, so Ebola is a person-to-person infectious disease, so the movement of people is very important for understanding the spread of the disease. Mobile phone companies in West Africa had call records that provide some information about mobility of people. There were researchers who were capable of analyzing this data, who had volunteered to analyze this data, and the process of them getting access to this data was incredibly slow and burdensome, and in some cases never even happened. So here we have a case where, under certain conditions, the use of this data could be done responsibly and could have helped with a major public health problem, but the ambiguity and uncertainty prevented that from happening. So I think there's a lot of situations like that where if we keep our view of like creating lots of new possibilities for us as a community, this can happen, and also for us individually. So many of you are in the position where you try to negotiate with companies to get access to data, and one of the challenges is they're probably a little bit afraid of that for a variety of very legitimate reasons. And so if you have a way of articulating what principles you will follow or how you will do your work in a responsible way, that makes it easier for them to provide you access to the data in a responsible way. And then I think the last reason that we should care about ethics is we don't really have a choice. Like, increasingly, this is one of the things that I see coming up as a challenge that more and more researchers face. So people using traditional methods in the social sciences, the research ethical norms around those things have sort of been worked out over time. And now kind of people sort of know what to expect. And now we're moving into this new era where the norms are not clear. And so you are all much closer to an ethical problem than you might expect, which is scary. And I hope we can have some better ways of thinking about how to avoid those things. So I think in the past, a major constraint on social science was what we could do, and I think increasingly will be what we should do. And so let me give you an example of this. There's a paper by Restivo and Vandereit about awards in Wikipedia. So they're very interested in what motivates people to contribute to Wikipedia, which is something that Anna's very interested in also. And so one of the things that they did is they did a field experiment, online field experiment, where they randomly gave certain editors awards and then measured how that affected their editing in the future. So this sounds like a very traditional kind of field experiment, but one of the things that's really interesting about this field experiment, from my perspective, is that it's basically, there's no cost constraint. All the data, all the outcome data is measured for free. The treatment is completely free. So there's no cost constraint. They could have done 100 people, 1,000 people, 1 million people. They could have, without any problem, had 1 million people in their experiment. So in that case, the main constraint was not what they could do, it was what they should do. So they decided that they did not want to have a very large experiment because this would potentially disrupt the ecosystem in Wikipedia. And I think increasingly we'll see situations like that where the main or a major constraint in the design of the study is what is ethically permissible. So if that's true, then this is going to become a bigger part of how we think about research design. And so when we think about research design, we often think about the trade-offs that we're making, between surveys and interviews and probability samples and non-probabilities. There's all these trade-offs. And so increasingly, I think ethics is going to be one of these dimensions that we think about these trade-offs. And what that means is that we need to be very smart about how we can move along this dimension in order to do the best work that we possibly can do. So by the end of today, I hope that you'll be able to design ethically thoughtful research and explain your decisions to other people. So I think part of the goal of the group activity is to give you practice talking about these things, because I think one of the challenges is for us to feel more comfortable talking about these things and for us to be able to communicate about them with others. Notice here I don't say like develop new ethical framework. Like we're not going to try to become philosophers here. This is very much like an applied ethics goal. But I hope eventually some of you might be interested in taking on ethics as an area of research for yourself, because I think there's actually a lot of opportunities for people who understand what are the real problems, like in the same way that bioethics is kind of an applied field of the philosophy ethics, philosophical ethics. I think there will increasingly be a computational social, whatever bioethics, whatever, there'll be that thing. And I think that computational social scientists have a role in that community. Okay, so another thing about the lecture and the reading. So many of you have read that book. I now understand that some of you asked for a copy and did not receive it, so come and talk to me if you want a hard copy. So one of the things about writing that book is I basically said everything I have to say. Like that is the best I can possibly say it. There's really nothing else for me to do. So in general, I'm going to assume that you've read that, and then what we'll do in class is do some more advanced things or different things or emphasize different things. I realize that expectation was not 100% clear today, so what we're going to do today is I'll do more sort of review, some new things, and then in future classes I'm going to do much less review and more new things. So is everyone clear about the expectations? So right now, I think there's kind of two dominant approaches to how people deal with ethics, and I'm going to sort of advocate for a third. So the first approach is the one I see more commonly in the social sciences, and this is what I would call a rules-based approach. And so in this approach, ethics is about IRBs. It's about filling out forms. It's about, do you have the appropriate elements of consent in your consent document, and so on. So this is, I think, because largely social scientists, much of our experience dealing with ethics comes through working with IRBs. Now, I think the relationship between IRBs and social scientists is kind of an interesting one, because many social scientists seem to complain a lot about IRBs and consider them to be slightly, I would say, slightly bumbling, bureaucracies, maybe is a good way. Not evil, but definitely not the source of all wisdom. But yet, then, when some kind of decision comes about whether something should be done ethically or not, people will often say, well, the IRB approved it, so we're good. So I think people have this they're simultaneously holding both of these ideas about the IRB in their head, and in the long run, I think it's difficult for us to place all of these decisions on the IRB. So I should say I'm actually on the IRB at Princeton, but I'm speaking here for myself, not for Princeton IRB in any way, shape, or form. And like one of the experiences from that's helped me understand the IRB much better is that they really don't know as much about the research as you do. Right? They can't. Like, you're the expert in the world in whatever study you're doing, and there's no way that the IRB can have all that expertise. So I don't think we want to be fully dependent on IRBs to make a lot of these decisions because they don't have all the expertise that they would need. You have a lot of the expertise. So the rules-based approach, I think, it runs into problems because the rules that were created for analog age research don't really cover digital age research very well. And the rules-based research does a very poor job. The rules-based approach is poor for explaining your reasoning to the public and to your peers. So like someone will talk a little bit about studies that have created controversy, and someone will say to you, why did you do that? And you will say, well, it's consistent with the common rule. And like that's not the most compelling explanation possible. So just saying I was following the rules, I think we can try a little bit better than that. So that's the kind of common approach in social science. The common approach that I see in sort of data science is what I would call kind of an ad hoc approach, which is that they're not really used to IRBs. They don't have a consistent set of approaches. It's not that they're not thinking about it. It's often they think about it quite hard, but they think about it on their own. And there's not a lot of accumulation of knowledge because someone thinks about it really hard and does something and then doesn't talk about what they've done or why they've done it that way. And then so everyone's kind of working on their own with their own set of approaches. So what I'm going to try to advocate for is what I would call a principles-based approach, which is that we still follow the rules, but I'm not saying we shouldn't follow the rules. If you have rules that you have to follow, you should follow those. But that we can abstract a little bit from those rules to think about what are the principles that lead to these rules. And then once we understand these principles can give us a language to talk about what we're doing with other people, can help us see the trade-offs more clearly. So the principles don't necessarily tell you, it's not like there's some magic algorithm and you put your study in and it tells you what you should do. But the principles help clarify what are the dimensions along which we're making trade-offs. And then how exactly you should make those trade-offs, that's obviously a judgment decision. But knowing what are the dimensions and seeing the trade-offs, that will help you hopefully do your research in a more responsible way. So to make this a little bit more concrete, I'm going to talk about 3 studies that you may have already heard of that generated some ethical controversy, and then we'll use these as examples to illustrate some of these principles. So the first is the emotional contagion study. So how many people have heard of this one? The Facebook experiment? Oh yeah, okay. So just to briefly review, they enrolled people in an experiment where they randomly blocked posts from their news feeds. For some people were put into a positivity reduced condition where they randomly blocked posts that had positive terms. Other people were put into a negativity reduced condition where they blocked posts that had negative words. And then there were control conditions, and then they measured the effect of this treatment on what kinds of words people posted onto their newsfeed. So there was a lot of, this was a collaboration between a data scientist at Facebook and researchers at a university. And there was a lot of controversy about this experiment without consent, the scale, and the ethical review process that this study had gone under. Casetizen time, this was a study by some sociologists at Harvard. How many of you have heard of this one? So basically what they did is they they scraped the Facebook profiles of almost all of the students at a I'm trying to get the words right, large East Coast university, and then they merged this data with data from that particular university about things like what the students were majored in, where they lived on campus. They used this data for some very nice papers that were published in very nice places. Then they made this data available. They had taken steps to anonymize the data. They made it available to other researchers, and then it became very clear that they had not actually anonymized the data, and it was possible to identify people in the data set. And that data is now no longer on the internet. So basically, I think no one is using it now. I will also say this research was approved by the IRB at this particular university and by Facebook. That's another piece of content. I should say, like, it's very hard to summarize these studies, so I will also say in the book I summarize them in more detail. I'm giving a big picture here. The last one is OnCourse. So how many of you have heard of this one? This one is less well known among social scientists. So this was done by some computer scientists who also run into a lot of these same problems, and so they wanted to measure internet censorship. So in certain countries, if you try to visit certain websites, it doesn't work. And wouldn't it be cool if we could have a real-time measurement system which would tell us everywhere in the world what sites are being censored from what countries? That would be cool. So one way that you could do this is you could get volunteers in every country to like visit every website and track it for you, but it's hard to get all of these volunteers, and actually having volunteers may expose those volunteers to risk in some of the countries where there is strong censorship of the internet. And so what they figured out how to do is they wrote a snippet of code which anyone could insert into a website. So let's say you have a personal website. You could insert their snippet of code into your HTML, and then whenever anyone visited your personal website, it would trigger this little code snippet, and then that little code snippet would do a measurement task. It would try to visit a certain website, and then it would report back to the researchers about whether they were able to successfully visit that site or not. So technically, there's a lot of nice things about this, but really one other way to think about it is you're basically secretly enrolling these people's computers in this measurement of censorship task, which could potentially put some of these people at risk. These particular researchers talked to the IRB at their university, and the IRB at their university said this is not human subjects research. And so the IRB did not even consider it. And so that is because, in my opinion, that's a reasonable reading of the actual common rule. There's a definition of what human subjects research is. This is not exactly what that is, because when the people wrote the common rule, this was not the kind of thing that they had in mind. And so one advantage of a principles-based approach, it helps get around some of these, like, well, where's the line? Like, clearly this is research that has the potential to harm humans, even if it is not human subjects research. And so this would definitely be in the scope of our thinking about ethical decisions. So these are all real examples. I've actually talked to the people involved in all three of these studies, and as far as I can tell, they're all very nice people. They weren't trying to do anything wrong. And also, I don't think they really expected that they were about to do something that people would be upset about. So again, when I'm sort of saying, I think you are closer to an ethical controversy than you think, I think all of these people felt like, no, what I'm doing makes perfect sense to me, it's totally safe, and then they realized they were out on a limb a little bit. So we're going to do this thing now where, this is something I do a lot, is I have people, it's called Thinkpairshare. So I'd like to know about some other examples. So you all, I'm sure, have examples maybe from your own research which you could anonymize. Maybe you have a friend who has had something happen to them. And so you're going to think for a minute about another example. You'll talk to your neighbor, and then we'll collect up some of these examples. So that's what Thinkpairshare is, and we'll come back together in like 1 minute. Go. Other examples.
The most basic of
Okay. Are there any examples that people would like to share while the live stream is on? They should be suitably anonymized, if you want, or not. Any examples that people would like to share? I heard a lot of great things. It seems like many people have challenges that they've dealt with or that they know people who have dealt with. Yep.
Yeah, so I'm working with some data that's technically public record. Like crime, like a lot of like crime data, felony filing data is technically public, but it's not linked together the way that an ordinary person would search for it. Like you'd search by like one court docket ID number or one alleged offender. But I have the data in a set of like 17 million cases and was able to kind of like go through and scrape public records and put all of this information like in a line where it's like someone's picture, their address, their name, their criminal history, the amount of court fees they paid, how much they didn't pay back yet, all sorts of stuff. And like this like it was initially difficult because on the surface I think open data is a great thing and it's public records, anyone could make it, but but is there like a problem with putting that much of someone's personal information in a convenient linked form for anyone to just go through and look at, even though it's technically legal?
So that is a great example. So this is a theme that many of you probably have discussed as well. So public information, and particularly what happens when you take a bunch of public information and link it together, you can potentially do stuff that none of the individual pieces could do individually, and that none of the people who release those individual pieces wanted or expected. But once it's public, maybe you can do these things. So this is sometimes called the Mosaic Effect. Like you take a bunch of shards and you put them together and you see a picture that you couldn't see from each one individually. And this is really, it sounds like it's really central to your research dealing with this issue. And many other people have this kind of challenge in their research also. Other examples or stories that people want to share? Mike?
Yeah, I'll give one. So this is a questionable ethics I'm currently involved in. It's a project we're doing now. So we did a project on negotiation with some of my collaborators.
Yeah.
It turns out like being tough in negotiations and like not very polite, kind of direct, actually works well. You get good deals in some situations. We did a bunch of lab studies. We wanted to take it out in the field. So we trained an RA to go through every Craigslist for sale page in the top 25 cities in America and like lowball people trying to sell iPhones on Craigslist and send some of them really nice and friendly messages and tough ones. And we did get IRB approval, but there's like a latent, 5% probability that one of them gets kind of angry back at us.
Yep.
So there's a certain amount of irritation.
Yep.
That we're causing.
Yep. Yep. So this is a great example. It touches on a lot of themes. So one is the way that a lot of research now is moving outside of the context where it's research and into more daily life. So when a lot of these rules were developed, there was this idea that like research happens in a lab, and kind of people understand when you go into a lab, weird things are going to happen, and it's clearly separated out from the rest of these people's lives. Here you have a case where you're doing this research in these people's lives. There's a probably also, this is like a blurring of research in everyday life. There's also consent complications here, right? And then there's also a scale thing, like how many people are involved in this study? Do you know? I mean, like, not how many people were in the lab study that you did, roughly?
200 at a time in studies.
Yeah.
This one's 750. Because
And
it's like you can really.
Yeah,
crank
exactly.
them out.
So why is that? You could have easily. You could build a bot. I'm sure some of the people here could build a bot, and you could just scale this up. You could have thousands of people in your experiment. Wouldn't that be so cool?
Yes.
I mean, right? It's both, right? If you could do it in a responsible way, then yes, you would be really excited to 10x the number of participants in your experiment if you could resolve this ethical challenge, right? So this is again, so sometimes questions of scale come up now that are different than what happened before. So now, like the emotional contagion had 700,000 people in it. So does it make sense to take ethical principles that were developed for studies that often have hundreds of people, and then if you increase the scale by a factor of 1,000, do these same ideas even make sense anymore? And then you have, again, the mixing of contexts. So actually a lot of these have context blurring, right? So we take data from Facebook and we combine it with data from a university. This involves researchers at a university and researchers at companies. Which sets of rules should apply in this case? This one involves mixing, again, research into sort of people's everyday life that they didn't enroll in. And then so also consent. Other examples? Yeah?
And so I'm sort of thinking about a project where I discovered an error on a website where I know that it's an error because it's on a registrar general of a particular developing country's website, and I found that I was able to access daily death records with names. The reason it's interesting is because that level of granularity, daily deaths, is very hard to get in a developing country context, and I'm interested in studying effects of temperature and air pollution on mortality.
Mm-hmm.
And air temperature and air pollution levels are data that I could get quite easily from public databases.
Mm-hmm.
I can scrape that, but the problem is that these death records, I've been able to access it for a large part of a very large city, where I know that the other registration districts haven't released that, because when I tried to access it from those registration districts, those data were blocked through some sort of key. You needed a specific key to access only your relevant death record. So I discovered the error, but I was also able to scrape all the information.
Okay. All right. So then this potentially also deals with consent, but potentially in a different way.
Right.
Right? Like, not from the participants, because not the dead people can't give consent, but you could imagine that the data owner, would have to give consent, and then this access to data, this comes up a variety of different ways.
Just to follow up there, which is that, I mean, I'm mostly just interested in aggregates. I'm not interested in individuals. So I use that data just to calculate aggregates myself. I mean, I tried to directly contact the vital statistics authorities to see if they would share that information with me without me having to do this. And of course, they don't respond. That's a part of the challenge, is that the authorities are silent, and then you end up having to do these kinds of creative things.
So these are great examples. I know we could have more, but I think these show very concretely that you are already facing these challenges, and I heard many other ones that maybe people weren't ready to share. So what I hope we're going to do now is give you some tools to think about these challenges, and hopefully make you feel more comfortable with the ultimate decisions that you end up making when you're doing this. So I think in general, I think one of the biggest why is this so hard now? right? And I think part of it is like we have increasing capabilities. We can do more stuff than ever before. Our power has increased, and by power I mean our ability to observe millions of people without their awareness and consent, and ability to enroll them in experiments without their awareness and consent. So we can do all this stuff. So we have this increasing power, but at the same time, it's not clear how we should use this power. So the rules are not written in a way that makes sense for what is possible now. Also, the expectations are really complicated, so it varies a lot by group, by community, by country. So we have this problem that there's power and increase ambiguity and unclarity about how that power should be used. So the way I would recommend that we think about this is with this picture. So right now, the rules-based approach is very much focused on what is in the common rule. So for those of you who are not in the US, well, so the common rule is basically the rules that govern IRBs in the US. For those of you who are not from the US, not doing your research in the US, I'm very curious to hear more about how these debates are happening in your countries. So the rules that IRBs are following are actually derived from certain principles that come from two sort of landmark reports. So the IRBs are mainly following rules that were drafted based on something called the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report proposes these three principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Those were mainly developed in the 70s. There's a second report that I think is also a great source of wisdom for us, and this is called the Menlo Report. This was developed by computer scientists. They were some of the first to run into the problems of digital age social research. So people that were studying things like online hacking and botnets. So there were computer scientists who would like go and take over botnets as part of their research. And then like you can imagine it puts you in some difficult situations. So a bunch of computer scientists got together and created their own sort of Belmont report for this kind of information communication technology research. That's the Menlo Report. And so that reaffirms the three Belmont principles and comes up with this fourth principle of respect for law and public interest. So I think for a lot of decisions, we're much better thinking in this space than we are thinking in this space. And then even these principles are derived really from two major ethical frameworks, consequentialism and deontology. And for some situations, we're better off thinking it here. So we're going to sort of walk this way. I'm going to go through these principles, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about these frameworks. So respect for persons. This is basically the idea that we should treat people as people. I mean, it's not a very complicated idea, but like, if there are decisions to be made, we think those decisions should be made by the people. It's part of respecting their autonomy as humans. So basically, the idea here is that participants should decide and not you. And this is where a lot of the ideas for informed consent come. Second principle, beneficence. And here the main ideas are minimize the risk, maximize the benefits, and then decide. So I think an important part of beneficence is that it's really, it leads you to, the Belmont Report really suggests a two-step process. So this step about minimizing and maximizing, this is potentially a very technical step. So like in OnCourse, how exactly are they triggering these third-party requests? Are they minimizing the amount of data? Are they storing it in a safe way? That is a very technical matter. So let's assume you go through this technical procedure to do the best you can at minimizing the risks and maximizing the benefits. Then you have a second step, which is not a technical step, which is, should we do this now that we've got the best balance we can? And so it's important to remember there are really two separate things here. One is actually quite technical, and here I think there's a lot of room for potential methodological research. What are ways that we can design these studies to make them lower risk or higher benefit? And then there's the second sort of non-technical step, and here I think it's very important for people to include non-researchers in these decisions. So one of the things about the IRBs in the US is they're required to have non-researchers on them. And I think that's really helpful because they provide much more of a perspective of participants and the public and the people who are going to be in these experiments than just a bunch of researchers sitting in a room. So there are lots of examples in the past where a bunch of researchers sitting in a room have made a bad decision and about ethics, and I think having this outside input is really helpful. So I think often if you are thinking about a study and you're not really sure about it, often people like to ask other students or professors. I think it's really helpful to just ask your friends and neighbors. Ask someone who not a researcher at all and say, here's what I'm thinking about doing. What do you think? And if you're nervous about telling your friend about it, then that's probably a sign that you might need to reevaluate what you're doing. So that's beneficence. Justice is about the distribution of burdens and benefits of research. So here, scientists have a very bad track record that a lot of the things that scientists have done that are not good ethically have been done to disadvantaged people. So people with poor education, prisoners, institutionalized and mentally disabled children, old and debilitated hospital patients. If you look at the sort of track record of scientists, it seems to be the case that when scientists do bad things, it is almost always to disadvantaged people. And so we need to be especially conscious of the distributions of burdens and benefits in our research. Now, that is sort of the traditional Belmont approach, which is that these people who have less resources and capabilities are deserving of extra protection. But now it's also the case that people are starting to think that these people should also have access to the benefits of research. So if we, for example, if we don't include pregnant women in certain medical trials, maybe you're saying, oh, we should protect pregnant women, there's added risk, but then we know much less about how drugs work when you give them to pregnant women. So it's also, this protection, there's also a part of it that needs to be inclusion. So OnCourse is a good example of this. So on the one hand, you might say, well, we shouldn't expose anyone in repressive governments to these internet censorship measurements. So that's a kind of protection-based argument. But then there's an access-based argument, which is these are the people who are most likely to benefit from this research happening. So it leads you to this. So I think when we think about justice, we have to think about both sides of justice. And then the last principle comes from the Menlo report, respect for law and public interest. And so this has really two parts. One is compliance. So this is basically what I was saying before about you should follow the rules if there are rules. And then transparency-based accountability, which is that some of these computer security researchers did things anonymously. So there is one, they would sort of take over a botnet, do some crazy scan, collect a bunch of data, and then dump it online and not say who collected the data. So the idea is that if you're doing stuff anonymously or you're not willing to be public about what you're doing, then that's probably a sign that it could be a sign that there's a problem. So this is sort of saying you should be open and honest about what you're doing through the entire research process. So one place where respect for law and public interest is particularly challenging is terms of service agreements. So I'm going to give a little example now. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but well, some of you may or may not have run into this challenge before. So let's think about how this would work in this setting with this particular study. So it's called MapWatch. And here's basically the abstract of the study. I'll summarize it very briefly. These maps are very important. However, maps are largely subjective. And now these large companies like Google and Microsoft are creating these maps, and they may be personalizing these maps differently in different countries. So if you look at a map in Russia, you may get a different map than if you look at a map in Ukraine. And right now, it's very hard for any individual user to be able to see that because you usually only get to look in one particular country. So what they did is they built this very cool system where they were constantly pinging these map servers and getting back tiles and then tracking them very carefully to look for changes and having crowd workers go in and tag them if there was changes. So they built this really cool system to track these changes. And here's an example of what they found. So this is the map of Crimea that you get in Russia, where they separate Ukraine from Crimea. Here's the map you get in the Ukraine, where they are not separated. And here's the map you get everywhere else, where they show a disputed border. So this is an example of the kind of thing that they were able to find with this system. Now, this actually potentially violates the terms of service of these websites. So they take this on very directly in their paper. This is what they say about why they're doing this. Many web platforms discourage crawling, and they sometimes explicitly prohibit research in terms of service. And then they say, we think that for non-commercial research in the public good, we should disregard this terms of service agreement. But we've tried to do this responsibly without producing unnecessary load on these systems. And then we're going to go and do this research anyway. So here's a case where they had this research challenge. They actually have an entire paper about how they think about terms of service agreements. They are clear about what they're doing. They justify their reasoning, and then they go ahead and proceed. Now, should you call attention to the fact that you're violating the terms of service agreements of these companies? That's a hard decision, right? Because you're potentially putting yourself at risk. In fact, I think in this case they're willing to do that because they are also part of this lawsuit against the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is a law in the U.S. that makes it illegal to violate, or let me clarify. It may make it illegal to violate some terms of service agreements. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know exactly what's in that law. But it is a complicated thing. So, right, you have this challenge where, okay, this research, it seems to be in the public interest, seems to be good. They've done the best they can to minimize the burden on these companies. It does require them to potentially violate this terms of service agreement. They chose to be open about what they're doing. Other people, when they violate terms of service agreements, they aren't open about it. So this is an example of one of the challenges of doing respect for law and public interest. So any questions about this?
Do you know if they did the crawling on university servers?
I don't know. That is an interesting wrinkle. So is the idea that so if the crawling was not done on university servers, it might have made it harder for them to be caught, or
it might have implicated the university.
Innovated the university. Yeah. So this they probably say in the paper. The other thing is that this brings up another thing, which is that ethics and fear of lawsuits are sometimes mixed together, and I think we should think about them somewhat separately. I mean, they are obviously related. But, so one question is sort of, what do you think is the right thing to do? And then the other is like, what will protect you from getting sued? You should be worried about both of them. And just protecting yourself from getting sued is not enough. Nor is just doing the right thing, obviously. You gotta be aware of both. Yeah?
So, just wanted to clarify, because the way you put the ethical challenge in this case was openness versus not disclosing that you're violating the terms of service. But you didn't actually say that you thought that potentially the unethical thing was to violate the terms of service itself. Is that also, in this case, up for debate, or is that something that we think the researchers were, it was legitimate to violate the terms of service? The question is, should they have told us that they
No, I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, I think it's a case-by-case thing. So, I would say respect for law and public interest. There is this compliance piece where they say you should follow the rules, and then there's this transparency-based accountability thing. And so they basically they don't follow this piece,
Right.
they follow this piece a lot, and they also follow the beneficence piece, and they also, I would think, there's not really a respect for persons piece in this, I guess.
But as in their competing imperatives, right? Because
Yes, exactly.
in their
Yeah.
interpretation
Yes.
of the beneficence principle, compliance is not mandated.
Yes.
Right.
So I think this is a great example. This is a great question leading to one of the challenges that you will have is that a lot of these principles conflict with each other, right? It's hard to follow all of them simultaneously. And so what I like about this one is it puts these two very much in conflict, and this is how they've chosen to resolve it. It seems like a reasonable approach to me. I think another reasonable approach is to say, no, it's a terms of service agreement. We shouldn't, and leave it at that. But like, I think thinking about it this way potentially, I hope, helps understand what are the dimensions along which they're making these decisions. Yeah.
So was there any response from Microsoft or Google on the results or on the stuff that they were doing?
Yeah. So you could argue that they're putting, in this case, the participants, the subjects, are these companies, and you could argue that you're putting the companies at risk by exposing this personalization that they're doing. I think the researchers would maybe argue that we shouldn't think about these companies as people, or
More like in terms that once the paper came out, were there any press release saying that, okay, we don't like you doing this, or like, okay, we are sorry about this kind of personalization practice?
I have not seen any of that. But yeah, so in general, when you're doing research about powerful people and powerful institutions, they can become upset. But if we don't do research about powerful people and powerful institutions, that potentially creates other problems. So yeah, I guess this particular example really hopes to, I think the first three principles you probably all learned about in your IRB training already. This is a principle you may not have seen before, and I hope this example helps clarify the challenges. Like, oh yeah, it sounds great, respect for law and public interest. Okay, well, who's against that? But then when you actually have to apply it, it becomes tricky to balance.
I guess one sort of positive response to that is that I've noticed, at least in one case, that the Yelp API, when I looked at it like 9 months ago versus more recently, they've updated it to be sort of more friendly to using their data for research, at least in sort of an aggregated way. So it may be the case that at least some of these companies are increasingly recognizing that it's possible to do research for the public good with their data, and not like outcompete them or something like that.
Yep. So one of the other things that these researchers argue is that these terms of service agreements do not carry the same ethical weight as a law passed by a representative body, and they don't carry the same weight as like a ethical principle agreed to by the research community. But then you run into other problems if you're doing research in, let's say, countries that have laws that maybe were not chosen fully by the people in those countries. Should you follow those laws? Or who are you to decide? I mean, it can get very complicated as you start doing, like OnCourse, for example. Anything that's international or in many, many countries, it can get very complicated. Yeah?
Yeah, I was gonna say, that's why I actually really like that diagram that was like increasing levels of applying ethics, because going back to your point, it's sort of like you can zoom all the way out and you can just say like, do I believe in consequentialism? And if so, maybe I think the pros of this research outweigh the cons, or do I believe in deontology? And it's like, maybe I just think it's a rule that you should never violate terms of service, or yeah, it's like you can zoom out a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And zooming in and zooming out can be really helpful, especially when you're in a discussion or an argument with someone, because what you'll start to recognize is one of the reasons why a lot of these, in my experience, a lot of the ethics discussions don't really resolve very cleanly. And I think that's largely because the people have these conflicting, working from different sort of ethical principles. So I think a lot of times you see arguments between people who follow consequentialism and people who follow deontology, and they make arguments from their framework, and that's not convincing to the other person at all because it's not their framework. So roughly, consequentialism, I apologize to any philosophers here, I'm going to try to summarize this in a couple sentences. Consequentialism is about thinking about the ends. So actions are good if they have good ends. And deontology focuses more on means. Like, we should make actions that have just means independent of their consequences. We shouldn't focus on the consequences. So a lot of these arguments, so the sort of respect for persons ideas is very deeply rooted in deontology. You should treat people with respect. And the beneficence about risks and benefits is very much rooted in consequentialism. And often when you, like with, let's say, the emotional contagion experiment, you had some people who said, oh, you shouldn't enroll people in experiments without their consent. And then you had other people say, but there's really small risk and there's a lot of benefit. And then other people said, but you shouldn't enroll people in experiments without their consent, because to them the benefits and the risks are not relevant. It's a much more of a deontological thing. Yeah.
But in the emotional contagion example, isn't it the case, and I could be wrong here, that Facebook users have consented to be, enrolled in many, many experiments constantly?
Not in an informed way.
Yes. So that is an argument that we could make, and I think what we will do after the next coffee break is we'll talk a little bit more about consent and what it means. So in the tradition of research ethics, a terms of service agreement to blanket be in any experiment, that would not be informed consent in a way that's consistent with the Belmont report. Yep.
So I think one of the things I'm starting to think about with respect to that, as well as with respect to the mapping project, is that that we cross boundaries in our roles. So when you're doing the mapping project, you're a researcher, but you're also an activist.
Yep.
And Facebook is a company, but they're also doing research, and they're maybe, I don't know, this kind of question, bound by different. Do I follow different ethics when I'm an activist versus a researcher? Particularly as a researcher, and I'm not a philosopher, but thinking about consequentialism, one of the things that I have to think about is that I'm not only, facing the consequences of this particular project, but, we're creating and recreating these norms and precedents. So it's not just that, I'm creating the output of the map, but I'm also creating this precedent that says yes, or it's okay or not okay to do that.
Yeah, I think we have to weigh those decisions about the consequences of our actions, not just for the participants, but for non-participants and society more broadly. So this is another way that I think the way that we think about ethics now, it very much comes from this idea where the harm can only come to participants. So whereas in this terms of service case with the maps, it's not clear exactly who even could be, maybe the companies will be harmed, maybe the governments will be harmed, maybe there's other people who can be harmed. So taking a broad view of who we need to consider when we're thinking about the costs and benefits. Also, again, the blurring of the context. So when we have, let's say, researchers working at companies, should they follow the rules of companies or should they follow the rules of researchers? Or researchers working as activists, which set of rules should they follow? And that's one of the benefits, I think, of the principles-based approach, which is that those issues don't become as salient as with the rules-based approach. So with the rules-based approach, you can say, I'm a researcher, I follow the common rule. And someone who works at Facebook could say, I work at Facebook, I follow the Facebook terms of service. And then they could pretend then that you're in a complicated place where it's not clear what you should do. Whereas I think maybe we can come up with some principles that are sufficiently general that they can guide people independent of the context that they're working in and allow people to work well in these mixed contexts.
Yeah, I did have a comment, but I don't know. Well, so I think the question of ethics in big data always makes me think about the South Park episode where everybody was downloading. I think it was like iTunes, and then like it ended up being this really horrible thing that I'm not going to talk about since we're live streaming. but so part of the question is, what does informed consent really mean in terms of big data itself, right? Yeah. So if we're talking about Twitter or Facebook data, people are signing terms of service agreements all the time. Nobody reads them. Nobody has any idea what they're actually really agreeing to by even just participating in those websites. And yet it's such a pervasive part of everyday life that it seems wasteful almost to not use that data or not look into that data to see how people actually are living their daily lives and how people are thinking about certain things. So it's that's not necessarily here nor there. I guess it's just a point that I always think about.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Because on the one hand, we'll talk much more about consent after the break. But in terms of the sort of hope-based approach, right, you can think we have this data exists, this data can be used for valuable research that benefits participants in society, but the way that this data came into being and the way that we have access to it is kind of gray, and if we could clear up some of that grayness, we could potentially do a lot more. So we'll talk much more about that after the break. But just one more thing about consequentialism and deontology. So when you're in a lot of these discussions, you will recognize the other person making one of these arguments. And if you then respond with an argument from the opposite school, you're not going to be very effective. So notice the framework the other person is working in and try to switch into that framework. Because then you should be able, after understanding these principles and frameworks and getting some practice, you should be able to toggle between these and you should be able to respond in the framework that the other person is using. Much more likely to be effective. Also, once you recognize these two, you know that each of these two has like extreme cases where they break down. So like the organ transplant thing. So some forms of consequentialism, we should just like take everyone in this room, cut you all up. You are all young and healthy and you have great organs. And so we should just cut you all up and get your organs out there and we could save so many people's lives. Like we should definitely do that. We'll save more lives and that'll be great. So, right, consequentialism has a very weird dead ends in it. And deontology also has weird dead ends in it. So like the time bomb example is a famous one. So there's a ticking time bomb in a city and you could just lie to a person and get them to reveal the location of this, but you shouldn't lie to people because that's a bad means. So right, once you recognize what argument someone is using, you can respond in that, and you can also know how to take that to its absurd extreme, which is a good way of rebalancing the discussion. Okay, so again, we're advocating not following a rules-based approach, but following a principles-based approach. We are not having to make up these principles. That is another great thing. Like, we don't have to start from scratch. We already have the Belmont report and the Menlo report. There's no reason to start from the beginning. And then, so thinking in this space is much more helpful, I think. And then occasionally we need to go to this even more abstract space. So applying these ideas can be really tricky. So maybe that all sounded really clear. Okay, we do the principles and the frameworks, and then we're good. We've already heard some examples where this can be tricky. And so after the coffee break, I'll talk about 4 specific areas where I think people will run into difficulties and how we can use these principles and frameworks to make sense of these 4 areas, one of which is consent. So take a 5-minute break, come back, and we'll get the 4 areas.